And the last one who I will invite to speak is Daniil N. Leiderman, ki trenutno predava umetnostno zgodovino na oddelku za vizualizacijo na Tehniški univerzi A&M. V svojem trenutnem raziskovalnem delu se posveča reprezentaciji vzhodne Evrope in Rusije v sodobnih videoigrah in sorodnih medijih. Docent dr. Daniil Leiderman bo spregovoril s prispevkom Gamification and Anarchism in Cyberpunk 2077. Mr. Leiderman, please.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here and for such a fascinating conference. I've really enjoyed listening to these talks so far. And if I may, I'm going to share the screen in order to put up my presentation here. Just a second. Oh, sorry, let me switch the settings here. Are you seeing, you're seeing my my side notes, right? So I'm gonna switch this around.
Yes.
That should fix it. Okay, great. So my presentation today is entitled Gamification and Anarchism in Cyberpunk 2077. And before I go much further, I want to define the peculiarly odious term gamification, which comes out of kind of both advertising and corporate and edu-gaming discourse. And usually describes sort of features introduced in order to, in a sense, trick students into learning because they're playing a game, or trick consumers into buying more because they're accumulating points or badges, or various other practices that attempt to sort of loop into human neurocognition in order to make them do a certain thing without necessarily their consent or desire, but presenting it using games as a kind of this kind of zone of free play that, in a sense, gets you to play along with your own freedoms. And I'm particularly going to zoom in, kind of working off this idea of gamification, on how anarchism and anarchist practice is presented in video games that, in a sense, imagine anarchist protagonists or imagine or present broader narratives of resistance to global capitalism or corporations, and specifically zooming in on Cyberpunk 2077. Because that game in itself is a kind of a important cultural milestone for Central Europe, coming out of Poland's most influential gaming company, CD Projekt Red, and which in itself is maybe a top 20 company in all of Poland, and a much expected kind of blockbuster that came out to extremely mixed reviews due to terrible technical errors, and now has set a kind of contentious online discourse. People who genuinely feel misled and tricked, and people who still hold out faith for the game's eventual rebirth. I personally feel that it's a particularly interesting take on cyberpunk and want to talk about it further precisely as an attempt to kind of ludicrously represent models of resistance and to explore anarchism and anarchist political models in a new medium. So theoretically, I'm heavily relying on Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, which already came up before during our conversation, and particularly kind of Haraway's idea of the cyborg as the protagonist of our era. She writes the cyborg is both our ontology and gives us our politics, being a kind of point of fracture or connectivity between these sorts of large edifices or discourses of, on the one hand, Western science and politics, which she represents as racist male-dominated capitalism, and on the other hand, the role of nature, which is repeatedly defined both as a kind of resource and, as crucially for Haraway, a kind of other return to origin or an Edenic return, which she also rejects, suggesting that the cyborg is a positive figure for her precisely because it's neither nor one or the other, and in fact seems to kind of break down those binaries altogether, break down the border war, and as potentially could resolve it in a way. And from this kind of sweeping claim that, in a sense, we're all in this position, Haraway also proposes tactical approaches to becoming more cyborg, or sort of exacerbating the qualities of the cyborg, where she defines it, first of all, as a sort of merging contradictions within itself, right? Being simultaneously about intimacy and opposition, or perversity and utopianism, and merging these kinds of approaches as, in a sense, always already united and only bifurcated or split by the kinds of binaries that Haraway hopes cyborgs can outmaneuver, like binaries between nature and civilization, for example. So the cyborg is a kind of Frankenstein, as she defines it, but a Frankenstein that's self-fulfilled, that's no longer looking for a return to an Edenic state of nature, that's not trying to become a real boy in a kind of sense, is comfortable with their artificiality and open to it. But of course, the problem of the cyborg inevitably opens up right all the way back to Rossum's Universal Robots and Capek's kind of fantastic coining of the term, where first we watch the decline and collapse of human robot utopia into dystopia, and then we have a kind of the conclusion, this fantastic moment of robots, trying to figure out how to reproduce again, and this notion of robots trying to figure out sex. So in a sense, sexuality plays an important role here, an important kind of connective tissue between the human, the machine, and the kind of utopianisms that Haraway is proposing and the breaks they're proposing. Because to her, the cyborg is both an anarchic model and, as she writes, an anarchic model that's tied up with, as she says, literally parochial issues, right? Being tied to as the offspring of militarism and patriarchal capitalism, not to mention state socialism. So, as Haraway suggests, that the legitimate offsprings can be unfaithful to their origins. And this final line, of fathers, after all, are an essential, is particularly an important twist of the knife to me, because after all, essence is all we were kind of talking about here. And for her, the cyborg is the ultimate kind of renunciation of essence, the ultimate embrace of puissance as an alternative, and the sense of kind of finding a new praxis precisely in this rejection. So to me, this is a fascinating kind of a way of approaching it. And this is how I fundamentally approached the issue of cyberpunk. Because as a genre, cyberpunk is one that already has a lot of established tropes. In the case of Cyberpunk 2077, we must acknowledge that it comes from a 1980s game, which imagined a particularly kind of dystopia of contemporary capitalism, right? So it was a world run by corporations, only far worse, a world where human life is cheap, but only far worse, a world where everything can be bought, but far worse. It was a kind of at least in the original text, a kind of a libertarian dark fantasy. The current Cyberpunk that came out from CD Projekt Red is quite a bit different, and imagines a very sort of much more anarchic point of view, focusing everything around this kind of city. It's a character, and the two protagonists, not protagonists, but major characters. The protagonist is always embedded in the vision you see, and they're only known as V, and they're, your space for choices. But the two characters that are kind of scripted out and have defined behaviors are and affiliate themselves with anarchist sides are both present here. And already here, they tell us, in a sense, a bit of the kind of instability of this discourse, because while Panam on the right is perfectly real within the space of the game, Johnny Silverhand, played and voiced by Keanu Reeves on the left, is not. He's a kind of a continuous hallucination that you begin to experience because of a traumatic event that happens to you in the game as he is consuming and overtaking your brain. So already here, the game addresses us as players from a vantage point that makes it impossible for us to tell which part of their reality is real and which part of their reality is virtual. That erasure, in a sense, is mediated both by technology in the game. You have a chip plugged into your brain that makes you hallucinate Keanu Reeves, and that you can't take out without dying, and by technology that we're using to play it. We have a graphical interface that positions us in certain relation to these models and modes, and it gives us certain choices and freedoms within that span. Both of these characters also represent anarchism directly. Panam is a member of a nomads faction, which within the game are people who completely reject capitalism, live in their cars on the road, and survive by raiding and smuggling in between various capitalist and enclaves, sort of fundamentally existing outside the law, but forming these kinds of communes that they consider to be a kind of family of disparate strangers, which you ultimately end up joining if you follow Panam's path and kind of join her kind of Oedipal family circle, or her kind of a rhizomatic family circle, rather, because they're all drifters and nomads that move around. Conversely, Johnny Silverhand is an anarchist punk rocker who became enormously popular and then leveraged this into terrorism, culminating in his death in an attempt to blow up the biggest corporate building in the city, which he successfully detonates, seemingly dying in it, but actually getting captured by the corporation and scanned into a chip, which is then used to experiment upon, in a direct reference to William Gibson's Neuromancer, where one of the major plot lines is the protagonist rescuing an old mentor who exists in the form of a chip and only works in order to die because he no longer wants to live this way. Indeed, the chip becomes a kind of key moment for the game. For early in the game, about 10 hours in, the protagonist and the protagonist's best friend and him attempt to steal the chip, which is supposed to grant immortality to the ultra-rich, and sell it on the black market. The crime goes wrong. They end up, in a sense, both on the verge of death, and Jackie gives his best friend the chip in order to, he can hopefully get out alive, but the chip inadvertently saves his life and installs Keanu Reeves into his brain. Keanu Reeves then continuously pushes the protagonist towards more revolutionary action, which creates a kind of strange paradox in the game, where in the game there's an anarchist in your brain who keeps telling you to blow up the big corporation. And if you don't do what he says, he's going to take over your body and do it anyway. So you might as well do it on your own terms. And the profound unfreedom this generates is a constant source of fighting between you and Johnny, which you can act out in the game, yelling at him, ignoring him, taking various drugs to drown him out, and so on and so forth. So already here we have this kind of grand arc of cyberpunk defined for us. Cyberpunk is always about anarchist protagonists on the edge of society fighting against the corporations that rule their world. But the only way they have of doing this is by modifying themselves with the technologies put out by these corporate megaliths. And these technologies are always double-edged swords, always coming with problems of their own. And often the biggest problem is simply reliance upon the corporation further. William Gibson set up all of these projects right in the first kind of foundational novel of cyberpunk, Neuromancer, from which we have a large quote of his arc protagonist, Molly, sometimes known as Molly Million, sometimes by other names, who's not the protagonist of Neuromancer. Indeed, Neuromancer, she's kind of the romantic love interest. But in all of his other novels set in the universe, as well as his short stories like Johnny Mnemonic, Molly is always the recurring figure. And she is a heavily cybered up street samurai who both hires herself out for pay and for moral causes, often joining up with one kind of anarchist collective or another in order to challenge the corporations with violence. But this is the origin story as told in Neuromancer to the protagonist's case, where Molly describes, and you can kind of read this out for yourself if you want to, but basically describes that to raise money for the modifications to her body that make her a street samurai, in other words, her new nervous system, the blades in her fingers, and her replacement eyes, which give her a kind of combat interface and make her look like she's always wearing huge sunglasses. Molly worked as a sex worker, selling her body, but only literally her body, right? Using the chips installed into her nervous system to turn herself off while she did sex work, in a sense, receiving a paycheck after a few hours of blankets. However, she discovered that her employers found out about her other modifications, the blades, especially in her fingers, and started to use her to make snuff films, charging all the more for it, and since profiteering from her modifications in a big way, which culminates in Molly realizing this, coming out of her dreams, and note the motif of dreams, and the surrealist element will come in a little bit, revealing this to her, and kind of initiating her launch as a cyberpunk superhero. She murders everybody involved, including this US senator, and ends up kind of living in the underground as an anarchist assassin. Right? So Molly's origin story suggests this purity of this narrative. Right here, she is, in order to become an anarchist superhero in the cyberpunk world, she was forced to kind of territorialize her own body, allow corporations access even into the inside depths of her interior, completely territorialize her body to capitalism, and as a result is able to emerge. And so this back and forthness seems to be a continuous dynamic within cyberpunk narratives. And it's key in the way that the game stresses this through reference to Lucien Andalou. Specifically, the moment before your major heist gone wrong in the game, you get your last savings to install a brand new hand and a brand new eye, both of which will give you the enhanced edge you need to keep moving further. And the scene, as you can see, plays out as you see on above. Your Dr. Victor removes your eye from a first-person vantage point. You see it kind of go out and get plucked out. And then you see your new eye start uploading on the shelf. Before the doctor gets to it, moves it over to your body and plugs it into you, kind of reconciling your body with your vantage point as the player, which again is another kind of meta move. And much like surrealists use this cutting open of the eye as the release of the subconscious, here it's not only the release of the subconscious, right? Because you do get very pragmatic new ways of seeing things as a result of this surgery, but it's a very kind of materialist release of the subconscious, right? Down to the eye having its own corporate branding and only being compatible with that brand of gun in the game. Something that it turns into a little bit of an annoyance to the player because it's primarily a shooting game. Furthermore, this kind of misalignment again tells you that there's a misplacement between your body and the subjectivity within it, a misplacement that becomes a continuous part of the plot as Keanu Reeves or Johnny Silverhand is basically wrestling with you for control over your in-game body. Who gets to be in charge becomes a major part of the issue, not only in pragmatic terms, but narratively. If V ends up surrendering his body to Johnny Silverhand, you still play out the game just as Keanu Reeves now, a different person in the same body or in the same shell, even though that kind of investment is still you, the player, which becomes then another degree of removal and interface. One of the most interesting moments in the game comes in the visit to a brothel. Now, The Witcher, the Witcher CD Projekt Red's most famous blockbuster game had kind of almost notorious amounts of gratuitous sex in it, including multiple brothels. So players naturally expected this will be a scene of gratuitous sexuality. Indeed, it's not just a brothel, but a meat puppet brothel. So a brothel with women much like Molly, who plug themselves out and are operating presumably just as bodies guided by an algorithm. And you're told that they will fulfill your utmost desires. However, upon arriving in the scene, no matter whether you pick the male or the female meat puppet, the conversation goes exactly the same. Rather than any kind of erotic scene, the puppet becomes the only person to talk to you about death, about the fact that you're definitely dying, and that Johnny Silverhand will devour your mind or your body will die, and the choice is not yours, and provides you with a kind of a rare moment of reflection and therapy in a game largely otherwise about like adventures, heists, shooting stuff. So it's this really kind of twist on the expectations of the player, where once again, the game jars you out of the simulation, tells you, oh, were you expecting a pornographic pause here? Like, is this what sort of as the player you were wanted to in your kind of sexual interfacing? Instead, this is going to be a moment of intense intimacy. And it's intense intimacy is beset also by the other factor that you have a safe word lets you jack out of the simulation at any point. Indeed, is the only way to end it. And that safe word is Samurai, which is the name of Keanu Reeves' band. So even your kind of safe word to get back into reality is fundamentally contaminated with this thing territorializing your brain from this chip, right? With this anarchist rock star that's infesting you. So there is no real kind of you other than the you playing this game and not trying to kind of play with your expectations here, but expectations about sex and about connection, about various ways that connection can operate, which here is not through the human, but precisely through the machine. It's the algorithm that's telling you this deep moment. And indeed, if you say the safe word Samurai, you find yourself in a room with a deeply uncomfortable woman who doesn't know what happened, doesn't know what you're talking about. And if you start to kind of try to follow up on this deep conversation, gets really creeped out. So the whole situation is just precisely condensed to in a very Harrowaian sense, move us away from the idea of returning to the human and showing that the computer and the kind of the interface between otherness and the self is another way forward and produces its own meaningful connections, ones that you didn't expect, but ones that happen anyway. Furthermore, the game kind of puts this directly on the nose by paraphrasing yet another key moment from William Gibson in the culmination of the Panam romance, which, since the game has both genders and genitals in an interesting way, so you can identify as a woman but have male genitalia, and the game kind of allows that as a character setting, creating for various possible sexual identities within it. But the male heterosexual romance is Panam, who is the nomad. And in a key scene, echoing Neuromancer's scene where Molly kind of teases Case when they're plugged in together, because Case repeatedly is the hacker and he's kind of monitoring the systems, whereas Molly is the on-the-ground assassin. So whenever they're on a mission in the novel, he's plugged into her senses. And so he feels whatever she feels, but is able to give her like directions and guide her and like shut down security systems so she can focus on, doing violence. So Molly like messes with Case by exploiting their linked sensorium to give him sexual sensations. The same thing happens in the Panam romance in Cyberpunk, where you first steal a government tank, and then after having stolen it, Panam proposes this kind of a sexual encounter using the tank as a mediating factor. And indeed, and one of the most interesting choices in the game, in the sex scene that plays when you kind of have sex with Panam, rather than focusing on either Panam's or the protagonist's vantage point, the vantage point is almost consistently the tank's, showing you in a sense the tank is an active participant in this erotic encounter, and in some ways like as much a character in the situation as the rest of you. So the kind of new model of the heteronormative romance within the story ends up a kind of threesome with a tank. And this sort of arrangement, this kind of rewriting of new sexual models, to me again suggests another turn, because after all, this tank comes up again at the conclusion. It's very much a Chekhov's rifle. When you first ride it to attack Arasaka's tower, repeating the actions of Johnny Silverhand, but by the way, he just attacked alone from a gun, you ride from the street with a tank. In a kind of symbolic move that recenters your evolution with the ground, with nomads, with the kind of a catonic below, really literally catonic, you go into a tunnel and out. Move, whereas Johnny's vision was always coming from above on his private helicopter, suggesting a kind of different model for evolutionary praxis, one that evolves not only based on your own experiences in the game, but on Johnny being in your head as this disembodied territorializing voice. And again, the corporate technology acts in double-edged sword. However, the game has a very clear message in that sense. There are multiple endings, right? One ending, for example, you opt to support the corporation and let them fix you, which leads to a terrible consequences. You just upload it to a databank, essentially becoming Johnny. Other situations lead with you letting Johnny take his revenge and destroy the corporation with the aid of either Panam or his kind of old lover from 30 years ago, if you were connected with her. But the final real choice you make is after you destroy Arasaka with the aid of your sex tank, is the question of what to do with the rest of your life. And the choices you're given are pretty clear. Your body has been successfully territorialized by the chip. it no longer recognizes your mind's claim to it. You have 6 months to live if you want to live in your body. And you have the option of either leaving your body and becoming a disembodied program living in the internet, the ending that happens in Neuromancer as well, when the eyes offer immortality in a kind of afterlife of the internet, and letting Johnny have your body, thus living out his rest of his days as a rock star anarchist, come back from the dead, a kind of resurrected Jesus figure. There's a whole other story about the resurrection motifs in Jesus in Cyberpunk. Save it for another day. Or to do the ending that I think is probably most interesting, where you, in a sense, opt to die. But to die as yourself. You leave your, and it's called the All on the Watchtower ending. That's the title of the quest, referencing the Jimi Hendrix song about kind of returns to revolution, where you and Panam and your tank break the cordon around the city, trying to keep you dangerous terrorists out after having successfully accomplished the greatest act of terrorism in the history of the world within the game's span, to break the cordon and escape to Arizona and basically make it out of the context of the game into not an afterlife, but into a very, very brief mortality, right? You're 6 months to get. So in a sense, what we see here is a kind of grand arc within the game of the cyberpunk motif and its many possible praxis, many possible directions to take, played out around a kind of notion of what exactly to do with this world, where in order to resist the major networks of power, you have to kind of fully let them into your own body. And my papers kind of grow out of a conversation that happened a few years ago at, I believe, Aziz, the National Conference for Slavic Studies in the US, about what would anarchism look like, if mediated by Facebook as a platform. What would a Facebook anarchism look like other than a nightmare? And part of what Haraway presents to me, and Haraway's kind of reading of this hybridity and confusion presents to me, is that there is a kind of, and I think that Cyberpunk also makes this argument. There is no need to pursue these kinds of purities. On the contrary, to lean into these kinds of hybridities, into novel forms, into radical unions of the human and the machine, the inhuman and the human, and to lean into kind of the axes of desire, of sexuality, and of these kinds of human-machine eroticism in the very on-the-nose metaphors in Cyberpunk 2077. I think, to me, that this is kind of my ultimate conclusion as to what could be a counter to that Facebook, to that kind of Facebook anarchism, right? Facebook's major ideological content, as Haraway would probably argue, is to constantly offer yourself images of yourself as nature, yourself in the woods, yourself with friends, yourself just laughing organically, all of which are meticulously constructed. Some other alternative to this could be found in resisting that impulse to nature and finding kind of the cyborg as a new positive model already present, but finding new and new forms every day. So that's my talk. And thank you so much for the opportunity to speak once again.